Hi, I'm Ariel Fries with Akasha Counseling, and welcome to the Cancer Chronicles. Today we have with us Michelle Cooper of Core Therapy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And so today Michelle is going to be talking about preoccupation with food. And so I'm going to let her kind of dive into that a bit more and tell us what she's here today to talk about.
Well, today specifically, maybe I'll just outline a little bit of the big picture of what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about the struggle around food as a spectrum, right? We have the struggle with emotional eating, and then we have all the way to an eating disorder, a clinical diagnosis of an eating disorder. We'll be kind of talking about how that does fall on a spectrum, and also talking about a little bit about going into EMDR, which I'll get to later, and how that might be an effective treatment.
Wonderful.
For a struggle with eating disorders and emotional eating.
Great. So maybe you could start by defining for us what emotional eating is versus what an eating disorder is.
So eating disorders, and these are terms that are kind of prevalent in our world, are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. That's a newer eating disorder that's classified in the DSM. The DSM is like the Bible for mental health therapists of classifications of a mental illness. And emotional eating, again, looking at it as a spectrum, emotional eating or struggling with emotional eating is where you're preoccupied often with thoughts around food and your body, right? And again, I want to really call to light the fact that emotional eating, we are all emotional beings, and food does serve us in terms of catering to our emotional needs.
Yeah.
But when we struggle with emotional eating, we are noticing more and more that our preoccupation becomes negative. We are trying to control it. We're feeling guilty around it, and we are noticing that we can be more and more removed from life, removed from the things that really matter. Right?
Yeah. And you were saying before we dive into those signs, you were saying earlier that emotional eating can be like, we're celebrating a birthday. Here's a happy occasion, and we eat a piece of cake. And that being kind of like, in my mind, I imagine that as here's this emotional experience, and there's food paired with it, versus the other end of the spectrum where it becomes very hard to kind of separate those emotions, and when food is involved, and hard to control.
Absolutely. So if we can just take that example, right, where a piece of cake at a birthday party is a really healthy, normal, celebratory way to have food be a part of an emotional experience.
Yeah.
So if I was not struggling, right, with emotional eating, celebrating having my piece of cake, someone to my right who may be struggling with emotional eating, they might be so preoccupied with, should I have the cake? Is the cake going to change my body? Is the cake going to make me feel out of control around food? Will I feel guilty eating that cake? So they might be having this whole thought process around that cake, and really what's happening is they're no longer engaged in the party.
Yeah.
Right? They're really thinking about the cake, and that's when it becomes problematic.
Yeah. So maybe you could speak to some of those signs that you might notice are happening within you or within a loved one that they're struggling with an emotional eating.
So the biggest thing to recognize for yourself or for a loved one is secrecy and isolation. Right? Eating disorders or a struggle with emotional eating, they thrive in darkness. Right? So if you're bringing food into the bedroom, if you are hiding things, if you're feeling shame around it, oftentimes people experience guilt after eating, feeling out of control around food, or excessively using food to cope with emotions, right? If you're feeling stressed and eating, if you're feeling out of control and eating or not eating, if you are, really if you're just using food often to fill emotional needs as opposed to physical hunger needs.
Got it. Okay. That's very helpful. So what is the benefit of therapy in something like this?
So when someone comes to see me who's struggling with food and their body, what I start to look at is, how is your preoccupation with that? How is that removing you from life? So let me explain, let me give you an example, sort of like the birthday cake, right? how is, if you are at the park with your child, right, and you are in your head thinking about your body and negative thoughts on your body, what you ate for lunch, what you should eat for dinner, and really just spinning in thoughts and missing out on being present and engaged and playing with your kid, that's what I hope to shift in therapy, is how do we get more engaged with the things that matter? So we clarify what matters more than this.
Yeah.
And we work on ways to move more towards that.
Got it. That sounds great.
It's a really general way of looking at it.
Sure. And how about EMDR specifically? Maybe you can tell folks what EMDR is and how that helps in emotional eating.
So EMDR is, the fancy long word is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, but we're not going to use fancy words in here.
Yeah.
What EMDR is a treatment modality for people who've experienced trauma. Trauma, on the most basic level, is past experiences are still affecting us emotionally. So we have unresolved past traumas that are currently causing distress. Right? When we think of trauma, typically we think of like big trauma, right? I was sexually abused, or I was in a war, or I was, right, these big traumatic events. And EMDR is a great modality for those big traumas. But what we often forget about is a lot of us experience little traumas throughout our lives that go unresolved and can have the same emotional effect on us now as those big traumas. Yeah. So an example to help clarify is, say you grew up in a family where your parents fought a lot, right? And as a small child, you really didn't understand, or it was confusing or scary when that happened. Yeah. And you'd notice, when your parents would fight, you'd go to your room and you'd bring food, and that was soothing and comforting and made you feel safe, right? So what we might do in EMDR, what we do in EMDR, is we recognize that currently, maybe when there's conflict or whatever those triggers are that we identify, you have this felt experience of being unsafe, right? And we tie it back to, I had this core belief that I was unsafe in these moments, right? And what you learn there is, when I feel unsafe, food helps me feel safe. Right? So EMDR, again, what we do is we recognize trauma gets stuck in the brain, right? Our left hemisphere of our brain is our logical side, our right is our emotional side. So logically, I can say, I'm safe. Right here in this room, I feel safe, but emotionally, I might have a different reaction. Right. I might have a charged emotional reaction. So what we do in EMDR is, by accessing both sides of the brain, we integrate an experience so that we're no longer getting an emotional charge now. Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And you were saying when we were talking earlier that when you introduce EMDR to therapy, things seem to speed up. Healing and change seems to come a little quicker, huh? Yeah, absolutely. Even I have worked with clients for multiple months and then realized maybe there's some trauma involved in their emotional eating or their eating disorder. And we go in and we start EMDR, and often why the results happen faster is, if you notice when you talk, we're really logical often, right? And we can kind of have a hard time of accessing the emotional piece that is keeping us stuck. So I find, although EMDR can bring up some more emotions, it resolves it faster. So we work through things a little bit quicker than with traditional talk therapy, if EMDR is appropriate. Well, great. Michelle, that was so helpful. Yeah. Thank you for explaining all that, and thank you so much for being here today. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah.